Hey guys, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing director here at CinemaBlend, and I needed to get online to respond to people's critiques of Martin Scorsese's film, The Irishman. I'm seeing some negativity for this masterpiece film, and it got me to the point where I needed to turn the camera on and tell everyone who's complaining about The Irishman that they're wrong. Now, before you jump down my throat, I have great explanations and reasons why you're wrong, so follow along with the video. But before we get into that, do me a favor, go down and hit subscribe, turn on your notifications. You're gonna go down to the comments and yell at me anyway, so on your way down there, just stop, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications. We'll continue this dialogue online like people do, rationally. So Scorsese's movie has made its way to Netflix, and I totally understand that people are starting to check it out at their own pace. And the main critique that I'm hearing about it, even from people who kind of appreciate what Scorsese tried to do in The Irishman, is that the movie is too long. Listen, it clocks in at 3.5 hours, so yes, it's on the longer side. However, I'm going to point out a quote from the great Roger Ebert, who I think hits the nail on the head when he infamously said, "No good movie is too long and no bad movie is short enough." If you've been sitting in a terrible movie, you cannot wait for it to be over. However, something like The Irishman, which runs 3.5 hours long, legitimately felt like 90 minutes to me. I was so invested in the characters. I so desperately wanted to know what was going to come next that 3.5 hour runtime flew right by, and I would argue that there isn't a wasted scene in the entire film, that every single thing that happens with each of the main characters is totally pivotal to where the film is eventually going to go in the study of Frank Sheeran, who is Robert De Niro's character, and the work that he did for two different characters, both Russell Buffalino, played by Joe Pesci, and of course for Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino. A lot of this work is sort of laid out slowly and in conversational form, but every word of those conversations to me is extremely important and really relevant. And when you step back and think about the fact that once everything is played out, you realize that Scorsese is actually using two separate frame stories. That alone blows my mind. You definitely have older Frank Sheeran in the nursing home, who is recollecting what has happened to him over the course of his life, working with both the Buffalino family and with Jimmy Hoffa. But then inside that, you have a second frame story, which has Frank and Russell Buffalino heading towards Michigan for what we're told is a wedding, but we know is going to be an alternate storyline that we have to follow. So that's two major frame stories that Scorsese is sort of juggling. And then inside of those two frame stories is the third story, which is made up of flashbacks of all of these characters as younger generational versions of themselves. The fact that Scorsese can stick the landing on all three of those frame stories means that he needs all 3.5 hours of the runtime of The Irishman, and once that movie was over, honestly, it could have gone for another hour, and I would have been more than happy to sit there with all of these characters and all of these actors, so I absolutely think that The Irishman justifies its long runtime. Branching off of people telling me that it's too long, a lot of people are critiquing The Irishman and saying that it's boring. Okay, listen, this is a taste factor, and if you're not into this type of storytelling, then yes, maybe the lives of these potential gangsters, mafiosos, mob bosses, union representatives, maybe that's just not your cup of tea and you're not going to be into that story regardless. However, this is not a superhero action movie, and I'm not saying that because Scorsese tends to dislike those films and not treat them as cinema. This is character-driven, and it totally is born of the tension that comes from the potential of what might happen next. Scorsese has played in this sandbox before in films like Casino and Goodfellas, and to me, in these stories, he creates some of the most terrifying characters we've ever seen on screen because you never really know where they're going to go next. The unpredictability of the violence that exists in Scorsese's gangster movies is what elevates them to the top of horror, tension, thriller genres, and The Irishman ranks just as high up there with Casino, Goodfellas, and even, of course, the two Godfather films, because it's showing you another lifestyle, a violent lifestyle populated by men who will do anything to stay at the top of their game and who feel disrespected at every turn. If you do anything to potentially waste their time or their energy or don't show them the respect that they feel that they deserve, the threat of violence is potentially there. And that hooks me in a way that no other film is actually ever capable of doing, because it's credible, that those threats are believable. These characters that are created by the actors like Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Ray Romano, Anna Paquin, these incredible performers, they're totally believable. I recognize people that I know, friends and family, are shades of the characters that are at play in The Irishman. They just find themselves in a particularly violent situation, in a very dangerous world, and we wait to see how all that plays out. Sure, it moves a little bit slower than your normal blockbuster, but I would never be able to say that this is boring, because the material is so engrossing, and the obstacles that each of these characters face over the course of this 3.5-hour runtime is so riveting to me that calling The Irishman boring just means that you weren't paying attention from the get-go, and it was probably never going to be the movie for you. The final point that I want to bring up when people are critiquing The Irishman is the work of the de-aging to make the older actors look like younger versions of themselves. And here I will have to concede that yes, potentially, de-aging is not quite where it probably needs to be in the year 2019, so there is a sort of going with the material and allowing the fact that technology is not necessarily caught up to where it needs to be, to allow this part of the story to play out. Now, the reason why Martin Scorsese took The Irishman to Netflix, reportedly, is that no major Hollywood studio would give him the budget that he needed in order to take the years off of his leading men. And of course, Scorsese didn't want to compromise by not going with Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci, so he found the budget at Netflix that allowed him to still use those actors but have them play younger versions of themselves. And when you see certain scenes from the earlier bits of the movie taken out of context and shown on social media, I have to admit, sure, they do look a little bit wonky. It doesn't necessarily play, I'm sure, the way that a perfectionist like Martin Scorsese would like it to play. However, I will say, watching The Irishman all the way through for the first time on the big screen, those effects never took me out of the movie, because I understood that this is what Scorsese had to do at this stage of the storytelling in order to get to the younger days of Frank Sheeran and Russell Bufalino. It all means that later on in the third act of The Irishman, Scorsese is able to lean fully into the actors that he has cast. And again, I would never trade the opportunity to have all of those guys performing the things that they do in the back half of The Irishman if it means that they look a little bit shiny, squeaky clean, a little bit too pure through the CGI. But yes, if you want to critique the de-aging process for The Irishman, especially how it may look different on the more vibrant, sharper colors on your television set versus the grainier, sort of warmed version that people would see in a theatrical experience, sure, I'll give you the idea that the de-aging effects probably aren't where they need to be in the year 2019. And honestly, if we're talking about horrific CGI, at least the stuff in The Irishman was far better than what they did to poor Henry Cavill as Superman in Justice League.
You won't let me live. You won't let me die.
Naturally, I'm going to defend Martin Scorsese's The Irishman to my dying breath, because currently it's my #1 movie of the year. I don't think it's too long, I never found it boring, and the CGI did not take me out of it. But it is really interesting now that it's playing on Netflix and is making its way to other theaters to hear feedback from people who sat down with what I view to be a masterpiece and the culmination of Martin Scorsese's exploration of the gangster persona, and come back and tell me it wasn't as good as I think it is. Because you're wrong, it's terrific and probably one of the best movies that Martin Scorsese has ever made. You disagree with me? Head to the comment section. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me what didn't work for you about The Irishman. Tell me if there are things that you thought really worked well, and maybe we can find a middle ground to have this discussion. While you're down there, again, do me a favor, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications. We're reviewing movies like this all the time. We're talking about your favorite endings. We're reacting to some of the best shows on television. We want to make sure that you guys keep up to date with everything that we're doing here on CinemaBlend's YouTube page.